We're going to be talking today about a very unusual structure. This is a building which is located in Java, Indonesia, and this is a building known as Borobudur, or more specifically Chandi Borobudur. Chandi is a word that in the local dialect means temple. And this is a temple that was built somewhere around 800 of the Common Era and abandoned about 100 years later, and then not really rediscovered, not really known again to the world until the early 19th century when it was discovered by a British explorer. And this is a really amazing structure in terms of its scale, complexity, and symbolism. So Borobudur it's a Buddhist structure. And it actually has some of the elements that we would expect to see if we were talking about a typical stupa. That you have this kind of dome-like shape of the structure. We also have some elements that are kind of reminiscent of pyramid structures. It's very complex, and probably the closest real thing that we can relate to this is actually what's called a mandala. So in Buddhist iconography and Buddhist teaching, a mandala is like a cosmic diagram. It's a map of the spiritual world, basically. And this structure really is intended to be this kind of cosmic map. And more than that, it really is intended to be an enlightenment machine. Borobudur is a structure that includes a series of paths. So the idea is that you enter into the structure and you follow a path. And as you follow this path, you encounter over 500 statues of Buddha, over 1,000 sculpted panels and reliefs, and throughout the entire structure, you encounter all of this Buddhist imagery and iconography, and in a very didactic manner, it's all intended to communicate the Buddhist sutras and also teach you about the life of Buddha. And so as you go through the building, you go through the structure, the idea is that you work your way towards enlightenment. So it's a physical journey as you progress through the structure, but also a spiritual one. And as you encounter these different, carvings and reliefs, they're intended to teach you about Buddhism, and to help you reach that point of enlightenment, to reach nirvana. And so as you ascend through the structure of Borobudur, you also find that it's actually intended to reference specific levels of the world. The pathway begins with what's considered to be the earthly realm of desire at the lowest levels. That's known as the Kameratu. And this is this is represented and documented by the narratives around the base of the structure. And then you go up through the world of forms, or Rupadatu. And as you go through here, you see the different narratives carved along 4 galleries that are set at different right angles to each other. And then finally, after you work your way through this lower rectilinear or square section in the world of forms, you emerge up onto the top. And the top section, which is intended to represent the realm of formlessness, or Rupadatu, is represented by these open circular terraces and a total of 72 individual stupas. So all of these stupas, with the exception of the final stupa at the very, very top, included images of the Buddha. And the one at the very, very top, the last stupa, was deliberately left empty. It's intended to represent the formlessness of enlightenment. So we'll look here at some images that kind of lead up to and then through the structure, the site of Borobudur. As you approach, here's a marker stone you would see, and you can see the actual temple in the background. In terms of scale, it's about 400 feet long on each side and a little less than 100 feet in height. So here we're looking at an approach along the base of the temple. And again, the exterior here, the base, lower section, is the earthly realm of desire, or again, Kameratu. And much of the base actually has been covered. It originally included well over 100 additional panels, sculpted panels. But apparently there were some structural issues with stability at Borobudur. And probably pretty much right after it was done with construction, it looks like they went through and had to reinforce the building. And so the structure was shored up with buttressing. And the buttressing, unfortunately, covers the vast majority of the sculptural decorative works on the lower section of the building. So here we're looking at one of the images on the perimeter of the lower galleries, and here we can see the beginnings of some of the stupas and some of the other Buddhist iconography. The site in total contains 504 statues of Buddha, 1,460 stone reliefs on the walls, and an additional 1,212 reliefs augmenting the path. And path is a very important concept when we talk about Buddhism, about the path to enlightenment. And Borobudur is intended to really manifest this concept in a physical way. So Borobudur, like other Buddhist structures, like Buddhist stupas, does incorporate kind of the ritualized process of walking around the structure as part of its intent. And again, we call this circumambulation. And at Borobudur, worshippers or devotees they circumambulate through the structure in a clockwise direction up towards the top, and then of course eventually they got to come back down again too. But this is intended again represent a physical as well as a spiritual journey. So we see actually a variety of different scenes carved in the reliefs around the structure of Borobudur. Some of these include the previous lives of the Buddha, previous incarnations of the Buddha, and also scenes leading up to and including his life. The scene we're looking at here is an image actually of his mother, Queen Maya, in a carriage, and you can see her being pulled here. And so this is again an image of basically of the mother of the Buddha prior to the birth of Prince Siddhartha Gautama, who, as we know, would become the Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. So again, after you move through the structure, through the different levels, again starting with the earthly realm of desire, then moving up into the world of forms, or Rupadhatu, eventually you emerge into this upper set of rounded terraces, which is the realm of formlessness, or Arupadhatu, as you get closer and closer to enlightenment. And so as you get up to the top, we find these 72 circular stupas. And within each of these stupas originally would have been located a Buddha figure. Some of these have been quite badly damaged or stolen and removed, but each of them, other than the central stupa, would have each included an original figure. And if you look carefully at these different Buddha statues, we see a variety of different mudras also depicted, different hand gestures. For example, here we see the Dharma chakra, the wheel of the law, the movement of Dharma, really. As you get up into the highest terraces of Arupadhatu, it's also interesting that the form of the stupas begin to change. Instead of diamond-shaped openings, we have these square openings, which also represent another shift as you're moving up through this cosmic axis. The whole structure itself, Borobudur, is intended to represent an axis mundi, again, a central point of the universe, a connection point, where different worlds can essentially connect, the spiritual and the physical, for example. So we're going to relocate ourselves here and take a look at a different location. We're going to be talking today about a very famous site, which is located in present-day Cambodia. And the site that we're talking about is known today as Angkor Wat. And it's located at what would have been the capital of the ancient Khmer Empire. And the ancient Khmer ruled a very large area, included all of Cambodia, some of Laos, and in terms of its size and complexity, it's sometimes compared to even to the Romans, but we know much less about the ancient Khmer. But the ancient Khmer built this site. This was created during the first half of the 12th century, and the patron of this site was a man by the name of Suryavarman II. Suryavarman was actually a usurper king. He wasn't really intended to be king. His uncle was in control, and he ambushed and assassinated his uncle. And there's a legend about him, running and leaping up into the air and onto his uncle's elephant, and killing his uncle. And at that point, then he took control, and he took the name Suryavarman II, which means shield of the sun. He did some interesting things too. So he associated himself with Vishnu, and the Khmer, actually it's interesting because the Khmer kind of blend a little bit between Hindu and especially a little later on, Buddhist deities. But Vishnu is a god who, with the Khmer, was typically associated with times of war. So by associating himself directly with Vishnu, this was kind of making a powerful statement about himself. And likely because of the fact that he was a usurper king, if you will, he had to justify and legitimate his reign. And one of the ways that he went about doing this was by creating this enormous, massive, incredibly complex series of structures that we know today as Angkor Wat. The name Angkor Wat really is a very generalized name. It probably is not what this place was called back when it was created, because it translated simply means, Angkor means city, and Wat means temple or pagoda. So it just means city temple. And almost certainly it had a different name in ancient times that's been lost to us. But the site is remarkable for a number of reasons. One is its sheer size. It is one of the largest religious structures on the face of the planet. It's so much larger than any European cathedral that it boggles the mind really in terms of its scale. It sits on an area of about 500 acres. And even more remarkable is the fact that it's located in the middle of a swamp. And the process of creating this had to be incredibly complex. And it actually does not sit on a solid stone foundation. It floats. It's actually basically sitting on top of subterranean water because it's located in a swamp. What the Khmer did here was create a series of these retaining walls and platforms. And so this wall encircles the structure, which is then filled in with earth, and then another wall on top of that, almost like a cake. And each of these serves to contain this internal floating raft. And as a whole, the entire structure kind of sits on this foundation of water. And it worked. It's been there for over almost 1,000 years. So this is a good indicator that this was an effective engineering technique. And also, of course, there was a creation of an enormous lake all the way around the structure, which would capture runoff during the monsoons, etc. If we look here at the plan view of the site, we can kind of see how these terraces are organized and how they contain and form this space, which of course is the reason that it's able to float on top of this subterranean foundation of water and maintain its structure. The central component here, the middle of this, the 5 towers in the center, which are really quite large, are intended to reference Mount Meru, which was the sacred Hindu mountain where the Hindu gods were located. The Khmer kings associated themselves often with the Hindu deities. Later, we also see some association with Buddhist deities. But what's interesting about Suryavarman II is that he chooses Vishnu as his primary personal deity. And this is, again, a deity who's usually associated with war and also associated with death with the Khmer. And so we actually see his name throughout the complex, and it's actually the name that would be used for him post-mortem. It's the name is Parmar Vishnu Loka, and Parmar Vishnu Loka is not something you would expect to see during the king's lifetime, but rather on a funerary monument. However, we see it here. So this really kind of functions as a palace and as a funerary monument simultaneously, and that's unusual. It's also oriented to the west, which is the direction of death, also of Vishnu, but key here really is that he was kind of building his own tomb at the same time that he was using it as a palace. So, and this is kind of unique when we talk about the ancient Khmer. So again, this structure is really quite remarkable for a number of reasons. Its sheer size, of course, is immense. The moat on the exterior, for example, is about 5,000 by 4,000 feet. And of course, we can see how it relates to Hindu deities and Hindu structures, particularly when we look at the middle and at this representation of Mount Meru. Angkor Wat is quite well known for some of its extensive bas-relief or low-relief carvings. One of the most famous of these is the churning the ocean of milk. And this is a pretty remarkable scene. What we're looking at here is an image which represents this story from Hindu legend. And according to the story, 13 sacred objects were lost when they fell into the cosmic sea. And one of these objects was actually an elixir of immortality. And of course, everybody wants this. And so you've got this incredible cooperation, this activity taking place here, directed by Vishnu, where demons, in this case also known as asuras, are working together with basically the devas, who are the gods, and pulling back and forth in this gigantic serpent named Vasuki. They're churning back and forth the cosmic sea with the attempt to cause these things to fly back up out of the cosmic sea, where then, obviously it'll be a mad rush to grab them. Right at the middle again here, we have Vishnu who's directing as this huge serpent is being tugged back and forth. There's a lot of other really interesting things going on too with this. this action of pulling back and forth is causing other things to spring up out of the cosmic sea, including asparasas, or celestial dancers. And we also have some other interesting associations. This is also quite possibly intended to be a tool to measure the equinoxes. There are a total of 88 divas, 88 gods, and 91 demons, or asuras. And so 91 is actually the number of days between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, and 88 is the days between the summer solstice and that are after the equinox period. And so it's quite possible that this may also be intended as a tool for the measurement, really, of the movement of the heavens. Another famous relief from the site shows King Suryavarman II holding court. And it's interesting, we can see the use of hierarchical scale here clearly in his size as compared to everyone else. So everyone around him is much, much smaller, and you'll also notice that everybody is on their knees. So this is another indication really of the power of the king. He is shown in this case really as a godlike or divine ruler. So here we're looking at a plan view, looking down on the site of Angkor. And we talked about Angkor Wat already. And in this case, Angkor Wat is actually the square located close to the south, the more densely packed square, really. And the much larger area to the north of it is actually another site called Angkor Thom. Now, Angkor Wat is much better known, really, than Angkor Thom is, even though Angkor Thom is significantly larger. But Angkor Wat is best known because of its style. It really is considered to be kind of the height of Khmer architecture, whereas Angkor Thom, while it's much larger in terms of its overall scope, is less sophisticated. It was built by the son of Suryavarman II, Jayavarman VII, and he actually, during his reign, built more stuff, really, than all of the previous Khmer kings combined. He converted to Buddhism, actually, and created this very large temple at Angkor Thom. And he still includes, there's still a lot of Hindu references and imagery, including references to Mount Meru, etc. But rather than associating himself with Vishnu, he associates himself specifically with the Buddha. Here we're looking at one of the gateways into Angkor Thom in Cambodia. One of the things that people don't tend to realize when we look at these shapes, by the way, we look at their condition today, and they were quite different when they were originally created. They would have been whitewashed and also, in many cases, gilded in gold. So you have to kind of envision, instead of this dark stone, that all of these structures would have been basically gleaming white and gold, and really quite striking. Throughout Angkor Thom, we see these enormous, large carved faces located on different terraces. And we don't know for sure what they represent. Some theorize that they may represent the Buddha, and others represent that they may in fact represent Jayavarman VII himself. But again, this is speculation. We don't actually know what their purpose or function really was intended to be. Next, we're going to be talking about the Mughal Dynasty. And the Mughal Dynasty is really essentially, it's a Muslim dynasty that ruled most of northern India from about the 16th to the mid-18th century. The word Mughal, by the way, means descended from Mongols, to give you an idea really of kind of where these people are from. And there's a couple important people in particular we're going to talk about when we talk about the Mughal Dynasty and about some of the patronage and the arts from this period. The first of these is Akbar, and Akbar was considered to be the greatest of all the Mughal emperors, and he ruled from 1556 to 1605. Jahangir, who ruled from 1605 to 1627, was the fourth Mughal emperor of India, and he was a very important patron of the arts, and he ruled for about 22 years. And we'll see some really important central works that were created under his reign. So the first Mughal emperor was Babur, and his grandson, Akbar, who we talked about earlier, is considered again to be probably the greatest of all of the Mughal emperors. And Akbar actually was familiar with Western styles of book illustration because a series of Portuguese Jesuits actually gave him a gift of it was an 8-volume Bible, and it had been decorated by Flemish engravers. And so he set his artists to copying those engravings and that style of art. And although the style that really comes out of the Mughal court is really quite different because it involves using watercolor and this really incredible, intense burnishing technique. It was still influenced heavily by Western pictorial space and representations, and we see that influence here in this particular work. He actually commissioned a friend of his, who was a friend and a court artist, actually, to chronicle his life, to create a biography, and it's called the Akbar Narama, or the History of Akbar. And this is a panel from this. And it's a collaboration between Bazwan, who drew and designed the panels, and then another man named Chetar Muni, who colored it in and did the actual the painting with the watercolor. The illustration here, what it represents is an episode when Akbar was very young. And basically what happens is he gets involved with this interesting kind of contest. He mounts a wild elephant, which he then pits against another ferocious elephant. And the other elephant flees in defeat with him pursuing. And they run out onto a pontoon boat, which then capsizes under their weight. But Akbar manages to gain control of Hawa, who is this elephant, and can bring it back to safety. And so, it's this incredible story about, this young boy controlling these renegade elephants, but it's also intended to be an allegory about his power in general, about his leadership abilities specifically. So the next work that we're looking at here, and this is one of your key works, is a painting by an artist whose name we know. His name was Bichtir. And we know this because his name is actually also included on the work, and there's actually a self-portrait of the artist. The work is called Jahangir Preferring a Sufi Sheikh to Kings, and it is from a larger collection, another larger body of work known as the St. Petersburg Album, which was produced between 1615 and 1618. And it is, again, watercolor, opaque watercolor, and gold and ink on paper. And Akbar, who we talked about previously there, he was the third emperor of the Mughal Dynasty. He didn't have a living heir at age 28. And so he consulted with a Sufi, which is an Islamic mystic. And this mystic told him that a son would come. And soon after that, a male child was indeed born, and he named him Selim. Prince Selim rose to the throne, basically in 1605, and gave himself the honorific title of Nur-ud-Din, which means the light of faith, and took the name Jahangir, or Caesar of the world. And so this miniature painting we're looking at here is an image of Jahangir, and we see flames of gold which radiate out from the emperor's head against a background of a gold disc. There's a crescent moon near the border, and we have this really beautiful, complex scene here, which represents a variety of different things. That gold crescent, which has that moon, that very thin moon around the edge, is intended to kind of symbolize a combination of night and day, symbolizes the emperor's leadership and also divine truth. Jahangir is shown on an elevated platform or throne, and it's also circular, mimicking the disc above. And he's the largest of all of the figures in the composition, of the 5 figures here, which again is a manifestation of his size and his importance as well. And if we look a little more carefully at some of the imagery within the painting, we can also find out quite a bit more about it. So here we're looking a little bit closer at the image. It's interesting to note, by the way, that Jahangir traded with the West quite frequently, particularly after the establishment of the East India Trading Company, and he imported a lot of luxury goods from Europe. And the hourglass throne that he sits here on top of shows a combination of both Persian and Western influences in many ways. The radiant halo again here, right, indicates that he's the center of the universe and a light source. And then the figures on the left that we can see are actually organized hierarchically according to their importance. The lowest of these is the painter himself. That's Bichtir wearing the red turban. Above him we have King James I of England. Next is a Turkish sultan. And then finally at the very, very top is a Muslim sheikh, or a mystical saint. And so the point of this really is it's showing that compared to, when given the choice of all of these individuals, the one that Jahangir prefers, the one that he takes by the hand, is this simple, poor Muslim sheikh, this mystical saint. So again, looking a little closer here, you can see the Sufi sheikh stands almost at the same height, almost at the same level as Jahangir. who's accepting a book which is being handed to him. And you can see just a bit of a smile on his face. So he's engaging directly with the sheikh, and that is making a statement about Jahangir's spiritual leanings. We can also see, based upon the cartouches which are in the margins of the folio here, they also reiterate that the emperor favors visitation with a holy man over an audience with kings. So here below the sheikh we can see again an Ottoman sultan. We don't know for sure who he is. He's not really identified, but wearing a gold embroidered green clothing and a turban tied in a style that shows him, distinguishes him to be a foreigner, not a member of the Mughal court. And he looks towards the throne in supplication. Then we also have King James the First of England, who almost certainly never actually visited. We know he didn't actually visit the Mughal court, but his image was probably known through a miniature or something else, which the court artist Bichtir would have been able to use for reference. And of course, Bichtir here is shown at the very, very bottom, wearing an understated robe. And the robe is tied on his left, which indicates that he's a Hindu, actually, in service at the Mughal court, which is interesting because he's not a Muslim. And this would have been part of a folio, or a larger album of folios, rather, which would have included calligraphic text as well as painting. And we know that 6 albums like this were attributed to the rule of Jahangir and then also his heir, Shah Jahan. But many of these no longer survive. So in this close-up here, you'll see the Sufi sheikh handing a book to Jahangir. And you'll notice a contrast between the unadorned hands of the sheikh and the ring-encrusted and jewelry-wearing arms and hands of Jahangir. It's also interesting to note that the sheikh is not directly touching the book or reaching out and making any contact at all with Jahangir, which would have been a cultural taboo. Instead, he uses his shawl here to pass over the book to the emperor. If we look at the image of King James here, there's some kind of fascinating things we can derive from it. We know that that there was a portrait by John de Kritz that was actually given to Jahangir by the English ambassador to the Mughal court, and this is almost certainly based directly off of that portrait. But if you look carefully at King James's hand and his sword, it was pretty typical that in portraits of royalty like this, they'd have one hand on their hip and one hand actually on the hilt of a sword. But more than likely, the artist here, Bichtir, has deliberately modified that, has changed it, has shifted and moved the king's hand so that it's close to but not touching the hilt of his sword, so as to avoid any kind of suggestion of threat to his emperor. The artist himself here again is holding a red bordered miniature painting as though it was an important object, a prized treasure, and in this tiny little painting within a painting, he replicates his robe, maybe to clarify his identity, and places himself alongside 2 horses and an elephant. And more than likely, these were gifts. These are probably imperial gifts, things that he received from the emperor. And he's showing himself basically bowing down towards the emperor in showing gratitude, humble gratitude. So down below Jahangir's seat, we see these crouching angels who are writing in Persian, "O Shah, may the span of your life be 1,000 years," on the base of the hourglass that makes up the pedestal that he rests upon. So obviously here we're looking at one of the most recognizable, one of the most famous buildings in history. And this was actually created by the 5th Mughal emperor, and his name is Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan married a woman named Mumtaz Mahal. And there's really kind of an amazing story between these two, quite the rich love story. Supposedly the two met each other as children and immediately fell in love, and they led this very kind of enchanted romantic life together. But she actually died rather young. She died during the birth of their 14th child. The emperor was really crushed by this. In fact, most of the functions of state just kind of ceased because he was in mourning for quite some time and was continually visiting her tomb. And so he decided to build this structure. And there's actually a lot of debate about whether or not this structure was really intended originally as a mausoleum for his wife, or if it really he was going to build it anyway, if it was symbolic of other things. Some people believe it might be symbolic of the throne of God, but it certainly makes sense too that this was intended as the mausoleum for his wife, and began construction on this pretty much right after her death. The structure that we know today as the Taj Mahal was really quite unusual. Generally, Sunni Muslims prefer just kind of a simple burial, under the open sky. But the Mughal emperors were a little different in this respect, and this is really kind of the ultimate expression of these massive, beautiful domed mausoleums that were favored by the Mughals. It is really exceptional in terms of its scale, its stunning gardens, its ornamentation, and also its dramatic use of white marble. So again, there's a lot of skepticism really about the true origins of this building. Some people even speculate that it may have originally been a Hindu temple to Shiva, which the Mughals took over and modified and changed and enlarged, etc. But we don't really know for certain. But there is, of course, certainly this tremendous story about the love between Shah Jahan and his wife Mumtaz Mahal. But we do know, looking at this object, that it's also really an expression of the wealth of Shah Jahan. It's covered in marble, and the marble was brought from about 200 miles to the west. And it's not just marble; it's also inlaid with turquoise, carnelian, jade, sapphire, agate, amethyst, and other gems from all over the world. And it was really created in a remarkably short period of time. It was completed in 1653, and it's a tremendously beautiful object. It's really done kind of in a Persian style as well, and it represents really the height of that kind of Persian style as well. When we look at the surface of the structure, from a distance, it looks very much like it's white, like mostly white, and it is largely white marble. But if we look at it a little more closely here, we'll see that it is actually really covered with inlays of beautiful and brightly colored stone. So here, looking at the surface of the Taj Mahal, we can see again it's not only created out of white marble, but inlaid with beautiful variations in colored stones, including a lot of semi-precious and precious stones as well. There is some speculation that Shah Jahan actually intended to build a second structure. There's a lake directly in front of the Taj Mahal, and this mirror image of the Taj Mahal may have been intended to be built directly across the other side of the water, but done in black marble. And we don't know for sure if this is true, but it is a speculated theory that there was this intent that he was going to build his own mausoleum directly opposite of his wife's, but that never came to pass. Shah Jahan had 4 surviving sons, and then basically after the death of his wife, but then 3 of these died, and that left just one. And the one who survived basically deposed his father, took him out of power, and put him under house arrest. And he wasn't really imprisoned in the sense that we might think of, but in fact really was just forced to stay at the Agra fort. And he still kept all of his other wives and his concubines. And even though he was no longer in political power, he led a pretty comfortable life. He died when he was 74 years old, but it was apparently from a massive overdose of aphrodisiac. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting, finality to the tale, I guess, when we talk about Shah Jahan. The structure, though, tells us a lot about, really about his wealth, about his power and his influence, though, again, when we look at the richness of the decoration and also the amount of money that clearly had to be spent in the creation of this structure. So to get a better idea of where it's located, here's an image of India, and you can see that little diamond-shaped dot up there, and that gives you the idea of the location of where the Taj Mahal is actually specifically built. The city where this was created, it's in a place called Agra, which is where Shah Jahan took the throne in 1628. And by then, the city had been really converted into a flourishing area of trade during his rule. Situated on the banks of the Yamuna River, there was easy access to water, and it became well known as a beautiful and very wealthy riverfront garden city with meticulously planned gardens and Really a very wealthy and beautiful location. This is an image here of the forecourt. You would basically pass through on your way in to see the Taj Mahal. During the 16th century, this area would have housed shops as well, and through this monumental gate, you would have entered into the precinct, proper. It was made of inlaid and highly decorated red sandstone, a really beautiful and symmetrical gallery. You have this long axis of water which channels through the gate, which, and again, the Taj Mahal would be behind this, set up on a platform on the north end. The complex is about 1,860 feet on a north to south axis, and about 1,000 feet on the east to west. So here you can get a little bit better idea again of the overall site. And you can see the Taj Mahal at the top there, and flanked by buildings in red sandstone. One of those buildings serves as a mosque. Another one, which doesn't really have any known function, really may just be about visual balance. But we can also see the opposite site here, where it's quite possible that another structure was intended, and maybe it's not. It may very well be that what we see here was not the original intended final design. But again, Shah Jahan was deposed, and since he no longer remained in power, it may have been, kind of completed in a less complex manner than he had originally intended. So here we're looking into one of the interior spaces of the Taj Mahal, where we can see the sarcophagi of Shah Jahan and also of Mumtaz Mahal. The interior of the structure is actually laid out according to what's known as the 8 levels principle, which refers to, in Islamic belief, the 8 levels of paradise. There's a series of 8 halls and then side rooms, which are all connected to a main space using a cross-axial plan, which is a popular plan for Islamic architecture from about the mid-15th century. And also, interestingly, if we look at the minarets on the exterior, by the way, they're not functional. They strictly serve a decorative purpose. They're just intended for visual balance. They're not actually intended for use. So another image here of the interior and of one of the sarcophagi on the inside. It's also interesting to note that there's a tremendous amount of calligraphy created throughout the structure. There's more than 20 different passages and 10 complete chapters from the Quran that include passages around the main gate and culminate into the burial chamber. And if you put them all together, it really kind of suggests that he was intending to create a replica of heaven. It's interesting, though. We mentioned that he had 4 sons, and 3 of them died in conflict, really, and then the last one deposed him. His final son, Aurangzeb, who, again, took him from power and seized power for himself, took the title Alamgir, or Conqueror of the World, and he became quite an expansionist emperor. He had a period of great wealth, but this constant expansion took a significant toll on the empire and led to constant rebellions. And eventually, in 1707, after his death, the empire crumbled. So a little bit more about the materials used for the Taj Mahal. It is really kind of unusual that the whole thing is done in white marble. It was not uncommon to use some white marble, but typically Mughal-era buildings that, important structures like this, were built out of red stone, which was much more common and much more readily available. And white marble was usually reserved for inner spaces, sacred inner spaces, for the tombs of holy men and that sort of thing. However, as we know, the entire Taj Mahal's main structure is made of white marble. The structure also is inlaid, again, as we've also mentioned, with some incredibly beautiful stones like carnelian, onyx, coral, amethyst, lapis lazuli, as we can see in some of the imagery here. In an image here, we can see some of the larger precincts along the river. The Taj Mahal is also surrounded by a massive and beautiful and very complex garden. It's been raised up here onto an elevated foundation, as you can see, to make it quite noticeable from the river. By the way, the color variations here, you can see the red stone on the side buildings there, and also the white stone of the Taj itself. The red stone is often associated with kind of the warrior class, whereas the white with the priestly class. And so that's another interesting and probably quite intentional contrast. So a final image here of the Taj Mahal. giving us really an idea of its really incredible symmetry and beauty. And there are, again, some other theories about what this may have been intended for, whether it was really originally intended as a mausoleum for his wife or if it served another function. We don't really know. But one of the other theories is that it's intended to represent symbolically the divine throne, the seat of God on the Day of Judgment. And this also can, certainly be supported by the type of references, by the script, by the passages from the Quran, which are inscribed inside of the structure, and the references to paradise and also its eightfold plan. So we don't know for certain exactly what it's intended to represent, but we do know, of course, that this is one of the most famous and recognizable structures in the world. And Shah Jahan, of course, is immortalized largely as a result of his patronage for this particular structure.